not a good start.
Okay, so we're doing this again. So I recently completed my first embroidery project, and I wanted to share the process I went through as well as some of my lessons learned so far as a complete beginner to the world of embroidery. I started with a free pattern from DMC. These free patterns tell you exactly where to put what color and lists out all of the stitches that you'll need to know how to do. Trying embroidery has always been a little intimidating to me, especially after scrolling through all of this beautiful embroidery on Instagram. So these patterns give you a really great jumping off point and a really good introduction to the craft. So starting off, I traced the line pattern onto my fabric with a pencil, using an iPad with the brightness turned all the way up as a light box. These patterns are meant to be printed out and then transferred onto your fabric using iron-on transfer paper, but I didn't have any printer ink or iron-on transfer paper, so I needed to trace by hand. I had a little bit of trouble with this. Since the pattern is meant to be printed out, the lines were too thin and light, and that made it a little hard to see the lines through the fabric at times. Next time, I'll try tracing the image of the finished piece that's included in the pattern, since those lines will definitely be much thicker and much easier to see through the fabric. Okay, now to the main event. This pattern features two stitches, the back stitch and the long and short stitch. It took me about halfway through the outline to get a hang of the back stitch, and I also got more comfortable with the long and short stitch after filling in about half of the banana. It was particularly difficult to get the hang of this stitch. When I first started at the top of the banana, I didn't have a good feel for how closely to space the stitches, so the individual stitches are much more evident, rather than having the effect of flowing smoothly over the fabric, which is something I was kind of able to achieve much better later. Eventually, I got over the idea that every single one of the stitches needed to be perfectly and evenly placed. Instead, just making sure to slightly overlap the stitches as I went along. This definitely helped to keep the fabric from peeking through. The density of the stitches, and I guess just the overall look of the left side of the banana, is much closer to what I was going for when compared to the right side of the banana. And I also noticed that the length of the stitches isn't very consistent throughout the piece, so that's just another thing I'll have to pay attention to for future projects. After finishing up the embroidery, I wanted to do a little more to make this a finished piece that I can frame and hang up. I decided to add a really pretty crocheted lace border to the edge, so I needed to break out the sewing machine to hem my fabric. I eyeballed where to cut the fabric and marked my lines using some fabric chalk. I marked my lines on the front side of the piece because I was trying to figure out how to best center the banana in a rectangle, but now I can't seem to brush away the chalk lines. The next time, I think I'll use an erasable pen, or if I do end up needing to use the chalk, to make sure to mark my lines on the back side of the project. At this point, I thought since I was already going to be hemming the edges, it might be a fun idea to add a back piece to hide all of the embroidery threads. And I also thought that this would provide a much sturdier foundation for the crocheted border. I eventually got the edges ironed and pinned, struggled through remembering how to thread a bobbin in a sewing machine, and managed to sew the cleanest lines and the sharpest corners I think I've ever managed to sew. Ever. I'm still amazed that I managed to do that. I am so impressed with myself right now! Anyways, after finishing the edges, I sewed a blanket stitch around the edge. This creates a nice foundation to add the crocheted lace border to, and I used an embroidery floss that matches the fabric. The crochet lace pattern that I used is linked in the description, but it's just a couple of rows of V-stitches with a final row of picots? Picots? Picots?
Picot.
Now, I was having such a hard time starting this first row of single crochets. There was just way more slack than I was used to because of the blanket stitch, and I ended up just scrapping the thin crochet thread that I was trying to use the black embroidery thread that I had, since it's much thicker. This was a little bit easier and I was able to get all the way around with the single crochets, but I couldn't shake the thought that this was kind of wasteful and that I wouldn't have enough to even complete the lace. So I went back to the crochet thread, but I didn't actually unravel the row of single crochets using the embroidery thread. Those stitches helped to really anchor everything down, so there wasn't nearly as much slack in the blanket stitches this time. And after getting a good inch of single crochets using the crochet thread, I went back and unraveled the first row and continued on using the regular crochet thread. So some final notes that I'll have to keep in mind for next time. The plastic hoop that I used ended up leaving some dirt or grease marks on my fabric, and I haven't actually been able to get them out yet, so next time I'll try using a wooden hoop or just remember to clean my plastic hoops before I use them. The fabric around the embroidery is also really wrinkly and puckered, so the next time I use this particular fabric, I'll maybe try to add some lightweight interfacing to try to minimize that. Overall, I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and now I have a good list of notes and different things to try for next time. I think I'll try a few more DMC patterns to get some more practice in and hopefully get confident enough to embroider something original.